Good evening, Sridhar. Welcome to my program, Conversation with the Master. So, Sridhar has been a fund manager, a long-standing fund manager with Morgan Stanley, almost 15 years of fund management with Morgan Stanley, and he's now currently with Iran running their family office. I know that he's a CA, CS, and ICWAI by education, and the great thing is that he has leveraged that solid educational background into solid stock picking skills and fund management skills over a long period of time. The very fact that Inam's family office has entrusted their money to Sridhar talks a lot about his ability in fund management. So welcome Sridhar, welcome to this program. Uh,
Thanks, Mahesh, for inviting me.
yeah, you're welcome. Uh, just give me, yeah. So basically, the fact of the matter is that you actually started fund management with Morgan Stanley in 2001, and you were a fund manager with Morgan Stanley in 2015. But I also know that you were actually in Morgan Stanley in around 1994, 1995. So there's a story behind that actually. How did that happen? How did you actually get into fund management in Morgan Stanley? Uh, could you just elaborate on that, please?
Yeah. So I actually was working with Citibank, before I joined Morgan Stanley, and I was getting frustrated with the corporate bank and doing some rubbish banking work with all the qualifications that I had, and I was really looking for a change. And I just chanced upon a newspaper interview of newspaper advertisement of Morgan Stanley. They were
Okay.
looking for a financial controller and a company secretary. And I had all the qualifications that they needed, but I
Yeah.
didn't have the experience of doing it because I was doing banking.
Yes.
But I still applied. Didn't expect much out of it. But as it turned out, I was selected. I was possibly the fourth or fifth employee of Morgan Stanley at that point of time.
Imagine that. Yeah.
And I joined them sometime in April of '94 after the fund was launched, the Morgan Stanley Growth Fund.
Hmm.
And as it turned out, I didn't have too much of work as a company secretary or a financial controller. There wasn't enough work as I didn't have a full day's job. And that's the point when Vinod Sethi, who was running the funds at that time, suggested to me that if I want to do trading for 2 hours, because you remember in those days markets used to
Yeah.
operate only for 2 hours between
Correct.
12 and 2. And I just grabbed it with both hands. So that was my baptism into equities as such. I mean, I knew about equity markets. I was industrial training with a merchant banking firm in Calcutta during my CA days, but this was really getting into the thick of it. And from there, I guess I had the skills to read balance sheets. So it was a very small team. So I used to help the fund managers with reading the balance sheet, because in those days there were hardly any research reports. So you were doing most of the research, and whatever little I could do staying inside the office was basically reading the balance sheets of the companies which we already owned. And that's how the whole process started. And I started adding value to the team by giving them inputs based on the data that I could see. And I guess Vinod did see that I did have some skills. And over a period of time, it moved from just trading to being an analyst and then to a fund manager. So I guess it was by chance. It was not a designed process. But I guess I'm not complaining about it. I think I managed to learn a lot through the entire process, because I did go through the entire asset management processes, be it the back office, be it the trading desk, the financial control, secretarial, taxation, and compliance. So I did get a full hang of everything that happens in an asset management, and then finally I ended up as a fund manager
The
sometime
fund
in
manager,
2001.
yeah. So
Yes.
what I really hear is that you joined for one work and then you got opportunities along the way and you grabbed it. I mean, it was almost like a voluntary thing that I can do this, I will do this, and it went on from there to actually a fund management job, right? I mean, so
Exactly. So I was actually putting in a lot more work than what I was expected to.
yes,
But you were young at that time. You wanted to learn. I was, getting mentored by people like Vinod Sethi, Madhav Dhar, Akash Prakash. I couldn't have asked for more. I mean, it would have been my loss if I didn't take that opportunity and grabbed it with both hands and, learned everything that I could during that time. So I guess it paid off because of the enthusiasm that I showed, I guess. And things worked out,
and abilities, I'm sure.
Yes, and that's how I landed up as a fund manager. Not exactly by design, but I guess nobody is born fund manager, right? It just somewhere it falls into place at some point. So I guess mine was very different. I mean, I didn't come straight into an or something like that. Quite a different route.
Yeah. So let's get to this whole track record, 2001 to 2015, Morgan Stanley India Fund Manager, plus handling the the offshore India investment fund, right? In India investment fund, yes.
Yeah.
So, and both these funds have, outperformed their benchmarks substantially. So maybe the India fund outperformed Sensex or Nifty, and the offshore fund, outperformed the MSCI benchmark, right?
Yes.
So, what was the? Can you talk about the investment philosophy that helped this happen, or that allowed this to happen, or was there any, basically the philosophy, the process that allowed that to happen?
Yeah. So I think the initial stages, I was being handheld by Vinod and Ruchir and Akash and many of the others who were still there. So I would have to give them a lot of the credit for, guiding me through the new process that I had gone into, where you are given responsibility of managing a fund. But having said that, the broad philosophy was to look for companies with growth. I mean, normally people come to India within an emerging market context to look for companies which have growth. So I think the broad philosophy was to look for companies where you see there is growth. Now, so in some cases, it's already priced in. So then you're looking for growth which is not priced in. Where you think that your expectation of growth is far higher than what the market's expecting, or you're willing to play the compounding game, that if the company continues to grow at 20%, then I don't need to worry too much. I just play the 20% compounding game, assuming that the valuation is correct. So that was a broad philosophy, that you look for companies with growth, and just the only filter that we used to use is to try and get the management right. So you would end up meeting the management, doing some channel checks on how good or bad the management is. I mean, having said that, doesn't mean that you always are right. But if you do your due diligence, possibly 60-70% of the time you will be right, and that does play a big role, especially in countries like, say, India, where promoters play a big role in how the shareholder return is results in shareholder returns. The integrity of promoters is very important. So I guess those were some of the building blocks that we were using to filter through some of the stocks that we were selecting in the portfolio.
Great. Now, this other thing that I had, which was very interesting for me whenever I talk to various people, is that you are a product of 1994 to this period of time, and anybody who's been through 1994 to maybe even 2003 has actually started off with a bear market, right?
Yeah.
Right. So you've not seen a bull market. So currently, anybody who started off post 2008 would have seen only a general bull market. But you've seen in the beginning of your career a long bear market. We have seen another 2008 kind of bear market. So did that shape your philosophy in any way? Did it impact you in any way?
It did, because I started in 94. The index was roughly, say, 3,800. And till I think 2003, index was still at 3,800, 4,000 levels.
Correct.
There was a brief period when the market went to 6,000 odd because of the tech boom. But those were restricted to really the, possibly the TMT stock, the tech, media and telecom stocks, as we used to popularly call that. And, this was a period where, whatever happens, stocks never used to move. I mean, if anybody says that we've seen bear market, unless you've experienced something like that, where for 10 years, the market does nothing. And, it's a struggle to find, companies which can give you some reasonable return. I think it makes your fundamentals very strong, that you know by then, having seen 10 years of bear market, that what works and what doesn't work. By then you would have, gone through the rigmarole of going through managements who tell you one and deliver,
Something else, yeah.
something else. Your institutional memory is strong about who in bad times also, told you the right thing.
Correct.
And I think those sort of help you in the future, because, once you're a crook, it's very, very, very difficult that that person will change.
Yeah.
And so I guess you learn from mistakes. In my case, I learned from my seniors' mistakes, because I was closely watching them. I was on the trading desk, I was the analyst, and I could see the frustration that they went through, because whatever happens, stocks never used to move. I mean, barring those 2 years of mania where things went completely berserk, but only for a very select stocks. It was a really tough period. I would say that possibly is the worst bear market that India has seen till now. I guess I don't know if we've had 10 years of markets where markets have done nothing and no significant returns for that period.
Correct. I don't think we have. Even 2008, actually, by the time people even understood what was happening, it was over. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
So
exactly.
There was hardly a bear market, really, in that sense. It was the long period of doing nothing, which is the painful period. And that was the period that you were talking about, yes. So it's clearly that it told you what not to do. And it also gave you a background of which are the managements that could be trusted, even in the future when the going is good. So probably that helped, right? So, and even in the India offshore fund, you were only doing India, or was it a fund which was allowing you to, I mean, just generally allowing you to invest anywhere in the world, or was it just the India fund, or how was it?
Yeah. So I was looking at, the entire India team was looking at only India. For a brief period, we helped some of our fund managers with, say, investments in Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, but that was for a very brief period. But we were a very integrated team, I mean, which sort of helped. So we used to have a weekly call with all the emerging market fund managers together, and it was sort of a ritual and quite, I mean, if you missed the call, you had to have some reason to have missed it. It was fairly strict in that, and it used to be very useful, because sitting in India, you're hearing from your fund managers from from Brazil to Russia to China to Korea, and very early in the fund management baptism, I realized that India is part of the emerging markets, and broadly it mimics what is happening within this asset class. There is no separate path that India will take, and India's growth will be great, yet our market returns are going to be substantially different from the emerging markets. I realized very early that unless the entire stars are not aligned, whatever you do, it's not going to help, which is what happened if you see between, say, 94 and 2003. And from 2003, if you see, the markets rallied. It was a global rally. Entire emerging markets rallied, everybody rallied. And when the fall came again post-Lehman, everybody fell. Again, there was a rally. It was reasonably synchronized. I reasonably understood by then, and thanks to all these calls which we used to have, that it is important to understand what's happening in other markets. So the interest to improve your skills on what is happening to large companies, large markets, and how they are behaving, and what are the dynamics. In some cases, you get early signals from other countries, which you can replicate, like countries which have commodity dominated. Then you get some sense of what's happening to commodity prices. So I think those used to help. Being part of an integrated emerging markets team really helped trying to build a portfolio in India.
Yeah, I'm sure, because at one point in time, now we look at Dow, Nasdaq, everything. Even an individual investor probably looks at everything. Probably in 1998, I remember when the Asian crisis happened, there were hardly anybody who even knew. So there was some kind of information benefit that you knew that Nasdaq fell yesterday or the Dow fell yesterday night, and nobody really in India actually was aware of the fact that this had happened, or not too many people were aware of the fact, or that Asian crisis hit, and not too many people in India were even aware. So there were those benefits that was available in that point in time, I think, at least.
Yeah, it was. So if you see, during the Asian crisis, Indian markets also corrected.
Correct.
And we were very much in touch with, all the fund managers at that time. Madhav and Vinod were handling the funds, and I used to get regular calls from them on what's happening to India, how was the currency behaving, what's happening to bond yields and stuff like that. So you knew what was happening because of the crisis that was happening. It sort of helped in trying to build your base of how to evaluate companies and markets. Today it's become global. Everybody
Correct.
needs to know. But back in those days when information flow was not so good, it was a great way of connecting with people who are in the respective markets. And I think it was a great ritual that we had on a weekly basis. Plus, we used to meet twice a year, which was initiated only in the last, say, 10 years, 10, 15 years, where we used to meet at least twice a year. The entire team used to meet, and once a year at least in one of the emerging markets. So I've actually traveled to at least 10 different emerging markets, going and meeting companies, understanding what's happening along with other fund managers.
Correct.
But it was a great experience because you learn so much when you actually visit the country and you
Correct.
see what is happening and how the markets function, what are the dynamics involved.
True. I think we lost the video there for a bit. But yeah, so this actually brings me to this point that is it now? So there was a period of time when I wouldn't call inefficiency, but there was friction there was a bit of friction in how to transact, how to deal, information friction in terms of how much information was available. So that helped outperformance a bit, maybe. Because I know stories of all, you would have heard of stories of people say कि मेरे बाप ने Wipro खरीदा था type of thing. Now I'm left with so many crores because that share certificate was lying, nobody sold. So that was friction, right? I mean, you
Yes.
didn't have the ability to sell because it was not that easy to decide and sell. You had to actually transfer it, and that was taking time, etc., etc. So it took a lot of time. So do you think outperformance has dropped as efficiency in the market has gone up?
Yeah, so actually, yeah, correct. So as I mentioned that if you take, say, 94, when I started, index was 3,800. Yeah. Today we are, say, 38,000. That's like 10 times in 26 years. That's hardly 9% return.
Correct.
But barring the last 5 years, Indian markets, people have generally outperformed. I mean, I remember during my time in Morgan Stanley, India was always classified as a country which will generate alpha. Whatever be the market, India will generate alpha. And we used to do that. I think 9 out of 10 years, we would have, stupendous alpha that we used to generate. And that used to come because of, the growth aspect that India had. And also the fact that if you did your basic stuff correct and you ticked all your boxes, you did your due diligence, the probability of finding a good company which is a compounder was very high. Especially, I mean, if I go back from 94, barring those 6 years where nothing worked, you leave that aside. There was a period where you could significantly outperform the market. You could find, outliers. You could find compounders. So I would say that I think last 5 years have been tough for outperformance, and maybe the last 3 years, fund managers have found it very difficult. But other than that, India has been a good place for fund managers to find outperformance.
Perform, yeah. So now let's come to the Enam part of your story. You're now working for the Enam's family office, running their money. How different is it from working as a fund manager for Morgan Stanley? It could be any time.
I think to start with, it was a great honor that they asked me to join. I mean, for me, the honor to work with people like Nimish Bhai or Akash and Vallabh, Manish Chokhani. It was a great honor that I got to work with them, and more than that, I think now that I know them for 5 years, I think they're great human beings. I mean, really great house to work in, and I'm very happy that I made the switch. I was actually looking to start my own fund when this dialogue started, and I think it was a good decision that I took. And I think from a process standpoint, I think it's broadly the same, which is, you're looking for companies. I would say the horizon may be slightly more. when you're managing a benchmark fund, like I was, there were times where just because of the benchmark weight, I'm compelled to buy a stock. And there are many stocks, say Reliance as an example, which has a very high weight, or any of the other thing during the tech booms of the tech stocks, which had a very high weight.
Yeah.
Even if you don't like, you have to hold some of these.
Correct. You can't be too underweight.
Now that I don't have, or broadly there is no benchmark, it becomes that much easier, and the clutter is much lesser. So I would say that's the big difference. Otherwise, the process, I don't think there's too much of difference. I mean, quality of management, looking for earnings growth, balance sheets, doing the due diligence, meeting competitors, getting a sense of what's happening. I mean, broadly, those are the processes that I would have done before, and I think it continues here.
Okay, so what I really understand is that it actually gives you more freedom, because there's no need to be part of a benchmark, or don't have to actually compare your performance vis-a-vis a benchmark. As long as you feel that the process is right and the company feels that the process is correct, you're willing to live with the fact that there might be a bit of a underperformance for a period of time, because you'll find that you're completely comfortable with the selection or the stock picking process that had been followed.
That's right.
Okay. So this is good. So you've seen two ends of the spectrum. One is where you are running a fund management, open-ended fund, which has a benchmark, has to beat it, outperformance, etc. And another is a pure stock picking with a proper, perspective of a longer-term perspective. So if you had, now you've seen 25 years in this market, and if you had an opportunity to actually go back in time and tell your younger self a couple of things that you know today, it could be life advice in general, stock picking things in particular, what would that be?
I think it comes back to greed and fear. I mean, honestly, if one is able to control your own emotions on greed and fear, I think half the battle is won. I mean, you go back to 2007 and you say, look at some of those stocks that were going up. I mean, the sum of parts, some infra stock, some land bank, and some rubbish here and there. And you would say, why did you even, think of buying those stocks? Or go back to, the tech boom. I mean, Infosys and Wipro were trading at 50 times revenue.
Yeah.
I mean, I wouldn't buy a stock 50 times earnings. I mean, we were buying 50 times revenue.
Yeah.
So I guess those are the, the learnings that you get having been in the markets for so many years. Those are the things that there are times when the markets are completely irrational, and it's how you're able to deal with those irrationalities. I would say that would be my biggest learning, and I would want to change some of those. If you ask me what could I have been more rational at those times when markets were so irrational?
Yeah, actually, but then I think you were at that point in time really part of an open-ended fund which had to outperform, and sometimes it is very difficult, I would imagine, to be completely, against the trend, so to speak, because you would then be totally underweight a few of the stocks and not necessarily the ideal thing to do, right? Which you could probably do today, for example.
Yeah. So, I mean, I remember even though in 1999, 2000, I wasn't managing the fund, but two stocks were 40% of our portfolio, Infosys and Z. Not because we bought them at 20%. They outperformed so much.
Yes.
I mean, they were up like 100 times in 1.5 years that it was 40% of the portfolio. I mean, I remember, Vinod trimming quite a bit of those portfolios. But when the fall came, it fell so sharply that you don't even get a chance to, sell the balance that you wanted to sell. So I guess there are times when, things are really irrational. I guess in my times, I haven't seen more irrationality than the tech boom bust. I mean, if somebody hasn't lived through it, so I can give you a good anecdote on this that, Wipro used to be a stock which suddenly came into the benchmark in MSCI sometime, I think it was 99 or sometime mid 99, it came into the benchmark. And it came with a fairly large weight because it was market cap. It was not free float adjusted.
Yes.
So the market cap was fairly high,
Yeah.
but the free float was only 10%
Great.
because Azim
Even
Premji held
yeah.
90%
Yeah.
of the free float.
Yeah.
So there was hardly any volumes. And our emerging market fund manager from New York used to call me every day, saying, Sridhar, get me some stock, get me some stock. That damn stock was up 9 times in 1 year between January of 99 to January of 2000. It was up 900%.
Yes.
But the story didn't end there. Just in February, it was up another 300%. Just February, it saw 300% more before it collapsed. So,
Yeah.
I mean,
it
was
nice.
so random and so crazy. And it was a large, index weight. In fact, I was just seeing the chart a few days back. Wipro is yet to reach that market cap even now.
Yeah.
So that is the extent that even after 20 years, you're still talking of Wipro not reaching the market cap or the price that it had
at that time, right?
in February of 2000. So I guess if you haven't seen irrational markets of 99 2000, you haven't seen anything.
You haven't seen anything, yes. So coming back to this now, so if you had no constraints as a fund manager, and or let us say you were investing your own money hypothetically, then where would that be? So all those constraints of the past, all the constraints, if any, of the current are removed, then where would that money go? Maybe no geographical constraints, let's say, no large cap, mid cap, small cap constraints. Where would that go?
Yeah, so I think Indian large cap do offer. I mean, I have invested in large cap for so many years, and I've seen this whole debate of large cap, mid cap, small cap.
Yeah.
Yes, there are opportunities in mid cap and small cap, but the strike rate is very important, right? So you invest in 10 small caps. How many of them actually give you the outsized return? Keep in mind that in the last 26 years, as we calculated, the market has given you only about 9% returns.
Yes.
If I take the last 10 years, I mean, Nifty was 6,000 a year back. We are at 11,000 plus change today. So you're talking about 6% return of the benchmark. So I think this whole this quest for outsized return, often leads you into companies which you regret later on. So I think it's better to have expectations which are more reasonable, more rational, and in the process you may end up with a multi-bagger. When you buy, I mean, I remember we used to have Eicher Motors in our portfolio back in 2010 or 11. And did I know that the stock will be, 20 bagger in like 2 years or 3 years? I didn't know. And I'm a biker myself. I had a bike. In fact, I had a Royal Enfield myself, but I didn't know that it's going to be, that sort of a multi-bagger. I mean, if I had known, maybe possibly I would have doubled up with my positions.
Yeah.
But that's how it is. It's just a good company at the right place, right time, and everything fell into place. And you ride the wave as long as you've done your homework right, and then you find multi-baggers. But at the time, did I know? I didn't. Possibly Eicher was, I would still say, was possibly a mid cap. It became a large cap. So I would say, instead of getting into mid, small, large, I think it's a quality of company if you like, whether it's large, mid, and the opportunity size that suddenly comes up in front of you. I think that's more important than too much of focus between small, mid, and large.
So you're saying kind of you would be agnostic to these things?
I'll be agnostic, but history tells me that mid to large on a sustained basis gives you better returns. Your strike rate is better. Unless you're a star and your strike rate is 90%, I haven't come across anybody who has a 90% strike rate.
Not really. Yeah, I guess you probably are right in the sense that in the mid and large cap space, maybe there is a history and track record of the company itself. So you have something to go by. So
and corporate governance, generally, you can say, because there are more people looking at it.
Great.
So you get more information. Your corporate governance is better. Obviously, there are small cap stocks which will do very well, but has never been my expertise.
Great. Okay. Okay. I get that what you're saying. So, if there is a young investor today who wants to do direct equities on his or her own,
Yeah.
and so what would is are there a couple of things that he or she can look at in the sense that some hygiene factors that they need to really take care of, so which you could recommend in the sense that some kind of screener which doesn't really pick stocks but at least tells them what they can eliminate, so narrows down the universe, to so to speak, so that they can they can then say that out of this I shall pick something that I really like, or some
So
anything.
I would say when you're starting off, you just keep it simple. If you cannot understand a company, what it is doing by reading about it in say 5 or 10 minutes, don't even bother about, and this I'm talking for a beginner. In fact, this can apply to even pro investors, but there are times when you go into depth, try to understand the sector and figure out there are many sectors. I'm from a commerce background. For me to understand pharma, chemicals, these are really tough things. And
Correct.
I've gone out of the way to understand them. It takes a long time to, get used to all these molecules, their names, and, what they do and how the whole thing functions. So first is keep it simple. I mean, if you can understand the company easily, and if you are a user of some of those products, many a times you will know that, if you had, say a two-wheeler, you're using a two-wheeler, you go back and see that you may have made money, or a Staples company, or a, AC, or a computer, or anything of that sort. I'm just saying something which is very easy to understand. The other thing, your own expertise. So maybe you're an engineer, maybe you're an IT consultant, maybe you're an IT professional, or you're doing something else. Your area of expertise, try and see if you can, pick a stock in that to start with and see how it works.
Yeah.
My general view to people who ask me this question is that unless you actually lose your own money, you never actually learn. So it is important that you jot down your thesis as to why you're buying X, Y, Z. And then possibly after a year, go back and check your thesis, whether it worked or not. And nobody gets the thesis 100% right. We've been here in the market for so many years. There are so many variables. But did broadly the thesis work, and how did the stock perform based on that? I would say that those are the broad philosophies I would give. In terms of, you can, if you really want to get into the balance sheet, then ROEs and ROCs are very important. Capital discipline is something which we look at very carefully. What is the management's philosophy as far as capital discipline is concerned? And the other thing is, of course, is there a leadership position that the company has? Top may not always be the top, but 1, 2, 3.
Okay.
So those are the broad things I would say that we would look at.
Yeah, that is actually a very important thing, since companies anyway sell to people within this. Companies do sell products. So if you're using one of the products, you really need to know whether that company is something that you would want to buy. So a product you like is something that you can go back and check whether that company itself is a company that you can consider buying. So you're saying you look at...
It's a good starting point. Yeah,
it's a good starting point. Yeah. It is something that a person can actually use as the basic tool to decide whether which are the companies that he can even consider, right, as a part of his universe, and then go on from there. Yeah, it is actually a valuable advice. I think very few people look at products in that sense, from the sense that it is part of a company which sells that product to you, and therefore is a company that you should consider.
In fact, I have a rule in my house that if I'm overweight a stock, then I would generally tell my wife or my children to buy products of those companies. So if I'm overweight, Nestle, we will have Nestle products. Overweight, say Unilever, I would ensure that the soaps and detergents that come into the house are from Unilever. Not that it makes a big difference, but it is just that if you like the company, then you should be using their products yourself.
And maybe
it's just a broad rule. It's not like you can always do it, but that's a broad philosophy I have.
And actually, maybe, I mean, if the product, if your wife or your kid tells you that this product is no good, then that's probably a warning signal, right?
Yeah, exactly. So it gives me feedback. Exactly. Yes.
Correct. So that might be useful. Yes. So let me Okay, very important thing, because now you are doing almost an unconstrained kind of investment. How important do you think is dynamic asset allocation for any investor? And this comes from the perspective that I'm a mutual fund distributor, and there is a set of category of funds which do this dynamic asset allocation. So forget the funds part of it, but at least uh, do you look at asset allocation as an important thing, or and dynamic asset allocation itself as an important thing?
No, I think I fully believe in asset allocation, even though I am in the equity market and that's my bread and butter. But I ensure that as far as my own portfolio is concerned, that I do follow a certain discipline on asset allocation, which is X percentage is in debt funds. I have some tax-free bonds. I also believe that one should have some exposure to gold and silver. Silver is difficult to get exposure to, but gold, and we've seen of late, gold has gone up. So you obviously can, time that. But I do believe that it's good to have a basket where the asset classes are different, so that when one does well, it is the other which is, holding on with some returns. And it's a general discipline which is good to follow. When you're younger, you could possibly have much more higher allocation to equity. And as your age goes up, it's better to diversify into other products. That's my broad philosophy. That it's better to follow some sort of an asset allocation, and I would stick to it. I mean, I remember I've been holding gold for 10 years now, and for possibly 6 to 7 years it didn't give me any returns.
Yes.
But the CAGR of the 10-year is now better than any of the debt products. In fact, they're coming very close to the equity average.
Yes, it is true. So, do you actually do dynamically? Do you change the allocation dynamically? Could be based on some kind of valuation basis.
Yeah, so it does. I mean, not too drastically, but possibly 5-10% movement either way. If you're not finding enough opportunities, or if there's sharp movement in markets, then there is a possibility that you could do some dynamic, but it won't change that dramatically. I would say broadly 5-10%, not more than that, between equity and debt. And I am assuming that a reasonable percentage, 5-10%, you keep in say gold, silver, or any of the other commodity basket. Then, I mean, some of the younger investors tell me that you should look at Bitcoin, but I'm too old to understand Bitcoin. But that's another option which people think, given the way Fed is printing money, the broad belief is that, we will see some of the other asset classes, taking, So that's the other option. I don't understand, but people who understand have made a lot of money on that.
Correct.
But as an asset allocation, it's not like you're going to put all your money in one basket, one egg.
Yes, yes. In fact, that brings me to a very important question, and it is that there were points in time in the past when investing money into equities was easy, and I'll tell you what is easy. When you yourself feel good about the your environment, you feel that everything is going hunky-dory, you are doing well in your life in terms of your job or your business, etc. And that is when you feel good about investing into equities. But the fact of the matter is that in the with this COVID times, for example, and when you know that there is a lot of uncertainty, or even in 2008 when the Lehman crisis happened and the market fell, there was huge uncertainty. Now it looks like a done deal that the Fed would come in and save the world. But at that time, it was not very clear whether they will be able to do all this with the money printing that they were planning to do. Today, for example, COVID and the economy, there is uncertainty. We don't know how it will all pan out in the future. In these times, how does one person actually invest? I mean, kind of man market invest karo, because there's a dissonance between what you're feeling.
Yeah. So I think, which is why for an individual investor, systematic investment plan is a great investment option. I mean, if anybody comes to me, I just tell them, just do an SIP. Because you are actually negating the volatility in the market. And over a period of time, you will get returns.
Correct.
It's unfortunate that possibly in the last 5 years, many of people who have done SIPs haven't got the returns.
Correct.
But I think over a period, this will, normalize, and you will get the desired double-digit returns. Whether it is 10 or 12% or 15%, only time will tell. But even if I take the last 26 years, we've come very close to 10%.
Correct.
I mean, to expect that equities will give you 20% CAGR for 10 years, 20 years, I think your starting expectation itself is wrong.
Totally,
so
yeah.
I think you to start with, you have to moderate your expectations that I should be happy with a 12% CAGR or a 14% CAGR over the next 5 years, 10 years. And if you're doing a SIP, I think you will reach that. So in my view, that negates all this noise that is there. Ki COVID hai, what will happen to market? Is the stimulus enough? What is happening to US elections? I think a lot of those noise will be removed. Every time there are some wall of worries in the market. I mean, I can't think of any time in history in the markets where there wasn't some worry or the other. So there'll always be something. But markets will, cross those worries, move on in life, and it will give you returns as long as you have patience. I was reading a very interesting quote on this where it said it's time, not timing. Which is that
time in the market.
It is the time in the market that gives you the return, not the timing, whether you bought at the bottom or not, or did you buy at the top or not. If you're doing a SIP, it takes care of that. It is the time which gives you the return and not the timing.
Correct. In fact, even in the so-called big bull market of 2003 to 2007, we've seen some months where there were a 30% fall. And I'm sure you remember the Amaranth fall that happened in 2006 May. That was Nifty fell 30% from the peak.
Yes.
And that was a bull market. And even now we call it a bull market. We don't say that there was one mini bear market there.
Yeah.
And even then it was very difficult to believe that we will go all the way back up, but we did. And probably the markets do tend to have a bias upwards.
So having said this, I do believe that earnings are very important for markets. And this is the example I give, that if I look at the last 10-year returns, index was 6,000, we are at 11,000 plus change. So that's about, say, some 6.5% returns. The earnings growth, unfortunately, for the last 10 years was roughly that range. So it isn't that earnings was that great. So we may say that the market's irrational today because, there is COVID, economies are shut. How can the markets go up? Well, the market's looking for the next year and the year after that. For whatever reason, if the earnings do not follow, the market will correct. So the whole argument today that, this market's casino, market's XYZ, it isn't. Over a longer period of time, it tracks earnings. Maybe a few percentage points, it may have, done better because of outperformance of the market or the re-rating of the market. But broadly, it tracks. There is a method in the madness. So I do think that at the end of the day, earnings have to come back. And the market's benevolent in, discounting earnings for this year because of all the, challenges that we are facing. And it's looking for the next year. If the earnings come, the markets will continue. If earnings don't, then it will correct.
Correct. It will. That is true. And that is where the challenge lies. I mean, so that is where the uncertainty lies. And that is how you say that SIPs are the best way, because you walk through you work through the uncertainty in that manner, right?
Correct.
So then, I would like to know a couple of things. I know you were an avid cricket player yourself. I think.
Yes.
I've seen you do that, and I have also seen you sing. So I know that these are clearly your hobbies. Maybe sports and singing is your hobby. Are there any other hobbies? And this brings me to the next question. Actually, is there a part of a routine that you follow on a daily basis that helps you in your investment process?
So broadly, So I would say broadly, my view is that if you take back your portfolio home and you keep worrying about the portfolio, you will end up making a lot of mistakes. So you need to have other passions to cut off your thinking process from the market's daily movements and the noise that comes. Unless you're able to cut off the noise, it will be very difficult for you to rationally make decisions. So different people find in different ways. For me, sports has been, a great sort of a friend who helps me with that process. So either it used to be cricket, but in normal days I go to the club to play badminton. So that's a ritual. I normally avoid meetings or dinner meetings because I don't want to miss my badminton in the evening. And yes, as you said, I play the guitar and sing so little bit. So that's like a stress buster which you can use. The other passion is outdoor, just an outdoor person. So I go for treks. Wildlife is a passion. I travel a lot. Because of wildlife, I started photography as a passion in the last 5-6 years. So now I've become a avid photographer, but more for wildlife than any other photography. So it's just the other passions which help you to keep a balanced life and try to follow that discipline of not having late night parties, go and have dinner with management. I have generally avoided that in the last 25 years, and met people in the office and come back home.
Somebody else also told me this actually. Samir Arora, I spoke with last week, and he said exactly the same thing which you are saying. So that seems to be working because he said that he doesn't want to meet managements and have dinners. Normally, he avoids all those things, and he has also said use the same words. I mean, it's almost
yeah. But for me,
uncanny.
the thing was that I have my options are meeting the management or to play badminton.
Yes,
and I think my evenings are for the badminton.
Truly. So then I think just as a parting shot, is there any advice that you would like to give a young investor? And I mean, somebody who wants to enter the market today, is there any advice? One thing that he should do or shouldn't do?
No, as I say, I'll repeat, it's time, not timing. So just stay invested in the market for a longer period of time. As I was reading somewhere that Warren Buffett made, I think 80% of his wealth after he was 80. I guess that has happened because of the power of compounding. So people underestimate that as you stay invested, and the power of compounding is dramatic. So the more you stay invested in, the better returns the markets will give you. Obviously, there is volatility on the way. And of course, keep a balanced asset allocation. I mean, that's my personal view that even though I'm from the equity markets, I do believe that balanced asset allocation is very, very much required.
So it has a role to play. So it really
means... It has a role to play.
I think very clearly, because simply the fact that your entire portfolio, the entire sum of money doesn't go up or go down at the same time probably helps a lot, right? To keep your balance
exactly
at times.
It does. And also greed and fear plays a large role, right? So when you're seeing, blood on the street, you may panic one day and sell. It does happen. I mean, for the, best of minds, you would make wrong decisions when you don't know what's happening. I mean, go back to March, the markets were 8,000 or below 8,000.
Yeah.
I mean, did we all not panic, or did we not think, oh God, what will happen? The global economy is shut down. I mean, those are times.
Yes.
So when you have a balanced asset allocation, it does help you that, you're not, some part of your portfolio is doing well, even in those times.
Totally. Absolutely right. I think that is the key to prevent yourself from making. Somewhere you have to help the process, help you to do the right decisions. And I think this probably helps you to take the right decisions about your own investment portfolio. So this makes sense to me. Is there anything that you would like to add? Because this is like an open chance for you to say, I might not have asked the question that you would want to answer. So is there something that you would like to say at all to the viewers?
No, I can only say that this is a segment which is very exciting. The entire stock market and investing and this whole thing about the process. So young investors, I would only say that, you have to invest your own money, lose some of it, and that is the way you you can generate long-term wealth for yourself, which is by investing in the markets. And it's a dynamic process. And it's a learning process. I mean, all of us learn every day. The learning in the market never ends.
Correct.
I mean, who thought of COVID and how markets will behave? So we're all learning as the markets are moving. So I think it's I think it's a great segment to be in. I'm lucky that, I made a switch from banking to, markets, which was
Totally.
more a chance for me.
Yeah.
But for others, my advice is if you can do it, I mean, this is a great, space to be in.
Totally. I agree completely. Whatever has happened these last 25 years, bear market, bull markets, we've all had seen good times being part of this market, right? So
Yes.
that is fantastic, actually. I really have to thank you for your time. You have actually been very forthcoming and given the kind of talk that would probably help an investor take the right decisions in the future for himself. Uh, Thanks once again. I know that you're a busy man, and the very fact that you did this is incredible for me. We will keep in touch, and maybe
Sure.
long
Yeah.
in the next 1 year, maybe there'll be a time when I might have to come back and ask you a few more questions
Sure.
about that particular point in time as things evolve.
Sure.
But it would be great to be in touch, and we'll meet again in the future.
Yeah. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
So if you ask me, these were the takeaways with the conversation that I had with Sridhar. He starts with saying that always do more than you're expected to do. Learn as much as you can. It always helps. So second thing that I heard was that Morgan Stanley followed the growth philosophy. They believe that as long as we buy growth stocks, even if the timing is not right, we'll generally be fine. The other thing that Sridhar mentioned was that growth without good corporate governance is not good enough. So you need good corporate governance along with growth. Then we talked about the fact that from 1994 to 2003, Sridhar had seen almost 10 years of a bear market. Other than the IT stock boom that was there in the 1999 period. So he said 10 years of bear markets teaches you to focus on doing the right things. They learned which managements can be trusted and who cannot be. Also, Morgan Stanley stint taught him the importance of knowing sectors and companies in other emerging markets. India, he says, does not operate in a vacuum. India is not dealing from the world. So this is what he learned with his stint in Morgan Stanley. When after he started investing for Enam Holdings, he's been freed of the requirement of a benchmark. So in Morgan Stanley, they had to be benchmarked to either the Sensex or to the MSCI Emerging Market Index. And in Enam, there is no such benchmarking requirement. So he says that there is much greater freedom when you invest for yourself or for a family office like Enam. There's the other advice that he had, and that key advice was to learn to be rational when markets are being irrational. This, he says, is very important and can make a difference between great performance and an average performance. So he gave an example of the fact that we saw this huge irrational rally, nothing more irrational than the rally in IT stocks in 1999. He gave an example of Wipro. In fact, if you have heard this, he said Wipro went up 9 times in 1 year, and in just one more month after that, in February 2000, it went up some 3 more times. So irrationality, because of various reasons, there is irrationality and exuberance in the markets, and that is the time when one needs to learn to be rational, and that can make a difference between great performance and average performance. His advice is to invest personal money only in large and mid caps. And there was a reason why he said that. He said that out of the several small caps that exist, to pick the right one is not that easy. But between large and mid caps, there are only around 250 companies. So you should be able to, your chances that you'll pick the right companies will be higher. The final kind of advice to investors was keep it simple. If you cannot understand what a company does in the first 5 or 10 minutes of reading about the company, then do not invest in it. So similarly, he said that it is a good advice to invest in areas that you understand. So if you worked in a particular field, then you could look at companies in that field or the suppliers to that company, the sector that you are into, or the clients that your companies or the sector that you're working in supplies to. So all these areas becomes your area of understanding. So you could look at good companies in that area. So when I asked him about what are the quantitative factors that an investor should look for while investing, he said ROC clearly is important. Return on capital employed is very important. It should be much higher than your cost of capital. Then he also said that capital allocation discipline is very key. Is the company consistently investing in areas that is reducing ROC? Then that company is not a good company to invest in. Finally, I think Sridhar has talked about the fact that asset allocation is the key to improve risk-adjusted returns. By that we mean that the returns might drop a bit, but the volatility will drop far more if you have good asset allocation. So asset allocation is a very important thing. It is the thing that keeps you in the game, which doesn't make you get out of the market at the worst possible time. So a good asset allocation strategy is very important to be a long-term investor. These were the takeaways that I had. I mean, I'm pretty certain that we talked about far more things, but this is what I think I took away from this conversation that I had with Sridhar.